All right, well, we're going to get started today. So good afternoon, good morning to everyone who joined, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Tackling Today's Challenges and Preparing for Tomorrow's Shift. This session is being recorded and will be distributed after today's session is over. All participants will be in listen-only mode. Questions may be submitted online, and if time allows, there will be a Q&A toward the end of the webinar. In the event that we do not get to all the submitted questions, we will be following up after today's session. At this time, I would like to turn it over to today's moderator, Mr. Jim Brill.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. This is Jim Brill. Thank you for joining our webinar today. By way of introduction, I'm a managing director in EY's construction and real estate practice. Civil engineer by degree with more than 25 years of diverse construction management and consulting experience assisting clients engaged in major capital programs in all areas of project delivery. The coronavirus pandemic has presented everyone with unprecedented challenges. The construction industry is and will continue to undergo varying degrees of disruption due to ongoing issues such as economic pressures, requirements imposed by national, state, or local governments, supply chain disruptions, and uncertainty around contractual provisions. This webinar includes experts in the insurance, construction law, project risk and execution, and scheduling fields. They'll address how these disruptions are impacting current projects and what you should be considering to better position your future projects for success. Our panel includes Josh Levy. Josh has an undergraduate degree in construction management and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Miami. He began his career as a construction practitioner for two large law firms in South Florida, representing developers and contractors. He currently leads the commercial contracting and advisory function team for Wood, where he oversees a $1 billion plus operation throughout North and South America. Josh is also a co-founder and strategic advisor to Document Crunch, which is a recently launched artificial intelligence platform that allows you to more efficiently review and advise on voluminous contracts. We also have Jim Reichert. Jim is a civil engineer by degree and spent the first part of his career with an international EPC contractor learning the business in roles from field engineer through project manager. For the past 15 years, Jim has worked for sub-default insurance carriers. He is currently a sub-default insurance risk engineering manager for AXA XL, leading a team of risk engineers across the U.S. that support AXA XL's sub-default insurance business. In this role, Jim partners with many of the best contractors throughout the U.S. and Canada on practices that support strong subcontractor performance management. We also have Rob Flieger. Rob is the principal of EY's construction and real estate advisory practice, where he leads the construction advisory service offering for the Central and Eastern United States, U.S. regions. Rob is a civil engineer by degree and has more than 26 years experience in the engineering and construction industry as a designer, project manager, project controls manager, and owner's representative and consultant. In his current role, Rob provides value-added services across the capital project lifecycle to support the effective and efficient delivery of capital programs. Finally, we have Mike Pink. Mike is an industrial engineer by degree and certified planning and scheduling professional. Mike is a founder and CEO of SmartPM Technologies. SmartPM is a real-time automated analytics platform that translates construction schedule data into objective, reliable, and concise visuals all stakeholders can understand and utilize. By leveraging this technology, SmartPM equips stakeholders with objective analysis to keep projects moving along and out of court. Prior to founding SmartPM, Mike spent over 15 years as a construction consultant and analyst. That's our panel. In addition to discussing how current projects have been disrupted, what makes this webinar different than many others that have taken place, we will offer some proactive mitigation tips going forward now that we're 60+ days into this situation. So with that, we'd like to get started. Regarding some currently going on out there, what trends or impacts have you seen over the past 2 months? Jim, from your perspective in the insurance field, what have you seen?
Yeah, probably one of the first observations I had was simply confusion. This is really the first time we're all going through this type of situation that's hit so globally and locally across our nation all at once. So seeing how different partners in the industry are trying to figure out exactly what this means for their business and their projects all at the same time has been very interesting. Things such as navigating the different government orders, Comes to mind, San Francisco was, I believe, the first to issue the non-essential construction shutdown. And just that simple term, the lack of clarity around that and the confusion that brought in the short term was really needed to be navigated. And as we saw certain other geographies take shutdown type of positions, that breeds kind of one set of perspectives and circumstances if that's where your business resides. But it's also fair to note that there's many geographies where, to quite a degree, business has continued and projects have continued as usual, perhaps impacted by safety and protection of employees and navigating that waters, or maybe owners slowing down or accelerating work. But for many areas, business has continued. So really seeing businesses look at how to survive the near term and then shift attention towards the longer term has been very interesting for me. I think the one element too, coming to this as an SDI carrier, is folks want to know, what are you seeing for defaults or notices on subs? And our program provides incentive around early reporting and early communication of subcontractor trends. And to date, what I would characterize as our notices kind of being along the lines of chatter. We do have a handful of situations built around specific project labor and some of that confusion I mentioned, as well as local supply chain. But to date, we seem to be in a phase where folks are trying to figure out how to navigate and work this territory together. We truly do feel that the next phases and the longer term is an important area of potential elevated risk.
That's great. And Josh, what about from the contracts perspective?
Sure. I think that at the onset of this pandemic, the collective industry sentiment was, oh my gosh, what's in my contracts, right? I think that there was this, I think that started really at the project level, but quickly extended out across the enterprise. As Jim was just talking about, there's so much nuance from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to what's going on or where the impacts may be trickling in. So understanding what is in folks' contracts and being able to make data-driven decisions based upon what's actually in your contracts across the enterprise was a critical, I guess, sentiment that I saw across the industry. And the takeaway from that early exercise was a lot of the contracts in our industry have not maybe sufficiently addressed the type of impacts that we're seeing. And maybe the terms were not as clear as common sense would say that they are. You think about this topic of force majeure, which for those lawyers on this phone call, that's a basic contractual premise that you learn about in law school. Well, many construction contracts actually don't even address force majeure. And so figuring out what terms would apply to this situation and how we were going to manage those contracts was really what I saw. And then kind of just as a follow-up, the potential for supply chain disruptions resulting from this, as this started in China, or maybe it didn't start in China, but we all think it started in China. And, there's a large amount of construction spend associated with materials and whatnot in China, but then other jurisdictions as well that maybe were suffering impacts related to COVID in advance of us here in the United States. So the supply chain disruptions also was an issue that we immediately started grappling with, and what that meant for our contractual obligations, and then downstream what that meant for the vendors, subcontractors that were being impacted by the supply chain.
No, that's great. Rob, given what we just heard with respect to uncertainty around insurance and contractual remedies, what do you think project participants be doing now to understand and mitigate their exposure?
Yeah, and I think the bottom line is that every capital program, every construction project has been impacted in some fashion, either directly or indirectly. That degree of impact has varied by geography. You heard Jim mention that some jurisdictions have mandated a shutdown of all non-essential sites. We've seen others that their impacts are more self-inflicted or voluntary, where they've introduced distancing provisions onto their job sites. We've seen supply chain disruption as well. We've seen productivity constraints happening on projects. Obviously, the longer the immediate situation continues, the greater the exposure will be as these impacts continue to place strain on project cash flow, particularly. For the projects that have continued, new site protocols, people have moved to shift work. We've seen modified means and methods, minimizing the number of people that are performing operations on site. Obviously, now you have new PPE requirements, new cleaning protocols, off-site or remote trailers, new site layouts. People are bifurcating sites to almost treat them as multiple projects within a single project site, controlled access points to test people before they come on site, people no longer sharing equipment or tools. All of that is impacting the productivity on existing job sites. We've seen a number of points of view that have been released in recent weeks. Some people have said, the impact is negligible. They can absorb it within their existing means. And others have said that impact could be upwards of 15 to 20%. So obviously all anecdotal at this point, but clearly people are being impacted in some fashion on their projects. We've also seen some positive impacts. All right, people are taking advantage of acceleration opportunities given the reduction in some of the logistical constraints. You've heard about DOTs accelerating their roadway projects because of reduced traffic on the roadway, rail projects, airport projects, school projects. When you no longer have to deal with the adjacent operations in the same fashion you had before, it creates some opportunities for acceleration. A near-term drop in the price of petroleum-based products, such as asphalt, is a positive that people are taking advantage of. Labor availability in previously oversaturated markets, particularly for the MEP trades, we're seeing people have greater access to a labor pool. So there are some positives that people are taking advantage of as well, and the savvy owners and the contractors are taking advantage of those opportunities.
That's great, and that's great, Rob. It bears in mind that there's probably some opportunities here from a technology standpoint too, Mike. That what you're seeing over the last few months in the situation that's been unfolding.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me. One thing I will point out, and we actually have a very interesting look at the industry because we can see with our technology what people are doing. We have this technology that analyzes scheduled data, and we've been we work very closely with our customers. And one of the things that we've been tracking is, what's happening to the schedule quality? What is the frequency of people analyzing things? Are they analyzing delays? What sort of delays are being analyzed? And also, are they looking at, starting to follow better project controls measures specifically around the schedule? And we're finding that the answer is yes. I would say based on, the time frame that we've been involved with the customers we work with, the amount of discussions that are having and the frequency and the use of the tools that we have that people are utilizing has jumped up tremendously. Not to mention that, we're hearing more and more from our customers. We have a customer success team here that, our former industry people that doing the consulting work that I did, that Rob does, that Jim does. And we're getting a lot of calls on how-tos. So the way that I'm seeing things sort of pan out is the way that you would expect. Contractors are needing to get on the ball, and they know it. They understand that we've all understood that scheduling is a very important aspect of the industry. Maybe not, people don't put in the necessary time to do all the things that we know are best practices. But what I'm seeing is that best practices is starting to become a focus point. Project controls is starting to become a focus point. Making sure that schedules are built well. Making sure that it has logic, reactive logic, making sure that they're not overly compressed are things that I'm seeing happening. Studying delay are things that we're seeing happening more so than we've seen over the past year, by leaps and bounds. The other thing is that I'm seeing from the people that I'm talking to is that the next wave of technology is getting accelerated by COVID. Project management technology is what's been popular the last 3 or 4 years. Most companies are well built, have built a process around PM technology, and it's working well. We all know that the next wave from that is analytics. The data's there, automation's becoming there. Project controls is about analytics, and I'm seeing that this is the next wave, and it's being accelerated as COVID continues. So COVID's acting as a catalyst for much needed change and much needed tighter project controls.
No, that's great. So understanding all those impacts that we're seeing right now, what actions should organizations be undertaking to combat these current challenges? Jim, starting again with you, in the subcontract insurance industry, what do you think? What are you counseling your clients on doing?
Yeah, so it's interesting the way we're kind of organized and focused. Think of it as like an enterprise risk management model, right? And I believe really strongly, right? Our industry is comprised of a contractor, an owner. Really, you're the sum of the aggregation of all your projects, right? So we tend to think of kind of big picture, but it's got to start at the project level. So one aspect is, right, take a deep breath, don't panic. Look at this through the lens of if you were dealing with these types of situations on one project, how would you normally handle that? And thinking about it that way should also then allow you to start to think about how to apply it more broadly. So a practice we would promote is until you truly evaluate and understand the risk and exposures you have, it's really impossible to manage that effectively. So use a tool like a project risk assessment tool. There's plenty out there. I'm willing to share one if folks, reach out. But use that to really identify where your enterprise exposures are and where your project specific exposures are. And from there, you can develop a strategy and a plan that talks about, where does senior leadership or where does focused leadership need to occur for that project to navigate their challenges? Where can local or maybe project leadership effectively manage that? And if that's the situation, how does kind of corporate or the enterprise risk need to support those local teams with the communication, the tools, the resources, and the support necessary to do that effectively? So that's kind of one area. Another thing I'm thinking a lot about is, right, I talked earlier about the confusion we saw coming into this situation. And as we start to see the country open up, and that means different things for different geographies and areas, but what can we do to undo that confusion? And again, from a project perspective, folks who are managing jobs and engaged in projects know the risks and exposures and how to best tackle them to get them up to speed. And up to speed is going to be a different speed, right? But it's about understanding priority and focus in, for those schedulers on the call, the critical path, the most important things to getting back up to speed. So really a strategy around making sure projects restart or move forward effectively, I believe is super important. And lastly, right, work doesn't shut down. Contractors and owners are currently taking on new projects and they're awarding trade contracts for work that's going to push them through the next term. So we're going to talk about it a little more later, but don't forget the importance of the risk you take on now is the risk we're going to be living with in the next period. So treat that with proper diligence.
No, that's great, Jim. And Josh, everyone who works on a construction project in the industry, once you start reading contracts, we all think we're lawyers, right? But from a legal perspective, as you're looking through some of the contracts that are in place on your projects now, what are you advising those teams, to combat some of those challenges that you previously talked about?
Yeah, if I could just maybe piggyback on what Michael had talked about and Jim, I think that there's really some great advice there. And so I think it's worth reiterating as you think about this. So one, your enterprise, what enterprise risk means to you on this phone call may vary from person to person. If you're the project manager out there right now thinking about your project, your enterprise is that project. And the stakeholders that are impacted by your project, that's your enterprise. And having a holistic appreciation for how this situation impacts your enterprise is critical. So you take that and scale that up to the, maybe the higher level executives on this phone call. And Jim's absolutely right. You're the sum of your projects. And to Michael's point, and so having a grasp on your enterprise is crucial to managing through this crisis. And to Michael's point, there are ample tech tools available where this industry, the construction industry, for a long time has been a slow adopter of technology. And there is certainly, I'm seeing it firsthand, an acceleration right now on leveraging those technologies. So, in Michael's case, the scheduling software and the analytics that provides is crucial. And, credit to AXA and Jim's group. I've seen a lot from them. I mean, I've known this about them for a long time, but I think it's being further underscored during this pandemic. AXA is making available a bunch of emerging technologies to help manage that enterprise risk. So you asked about, contracts, and one of those technologies is a venture that, I'm involved in as well, Document Crunch, right? So deploying artificial intelligence to extract those key contractual provisions, which may be an issue, in a COVID situation. I, as a practitioner, do not have an ability. I could spend, I don't even know how much time reviewing every single contract in my portfolio and doing an assessment, but there's technology that can do that much faster than I can pull out, and I can leverage that technology to allow me to then be a little bit more strategic. And so to answer your question, it's really about understanding whether there's relief associated with this pandemic in your contracts, in your enterprise, whether that's a project or across the enterprise. And then really thinking through, okay, so the terms and conditions may say X, but what type of a business partner do I want to be? Am I solely concerned with the outcome of this project today, or am I concerned about the longer term relationship and how my ability to leverage those terms or not leverage those terms may be construed or taken by the owners that I'm working for or the subcontractors that I have longstanding relationships with, and vice versa. So I think it's a bit of a complex exercise. First, you need to understand what your risk is, your enterprise risk, to come back to that term that Jim used. And there is certainly technology so that you don't have to push the wheel up the hill. And from there, understanding what's in your contracts. Once you have that baseline understanding, applying that to serve the higher business purpose that you may have, whatever that is. There may be a project where you need to be very stringent with your enforcement of the terms and conditions because you're facing a catastrophic risk, albeit liquidated damages or some other sub-default that may be on your hands. Or there may be a time where this may be the time to be a little bit more lenient and kind of come together and collaborate and think about, okay, maybe our contract's not so clear on this point. Maybe it's not worth fighting over whether I'm right or you're right, Mr. Owner. Maybe it's worth us splitting the baby here because we didn't adequately draft to impacts of COVID. So I think really contractually understanding and extracting the data is important, but then tying it to your strategic business purpose is really the special sauce, because as this panel knows, we've talked about it. I believe there's going to be people that come out of this pandemic. There's going to be those that are coming out of this pandemic thriving, and there's going to be those that may have faltered during this pandemic. And I think having some long-term strategies incredibly important, because that's the context by which that contractual analysis must be taken.
Yeah, and that we'll get into that long-term strategy and things around that in a second. But I think just to tie this out from a technology, from a tighter project controls perspective, Rob and Mike, some things that maybe you could be doing right now. Rob, I'll start with you to maybe combat some of these challenges, and then we'll quickly get into the future piece going forward.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Jim. And just to close the loop on the remedies or protections that might exist from a contractual or insurance standpoint. So regardless of what they are, what the interpretations are, one thing we've been advising our clients is just make sure that you're reserving your rights, exercise the notice provisions that might exist within the contracts and insurance and bonding, just to keep that open, in the event that interpretations change over time. So again, making sure you're engaging in dialogue with your legal folks to understand what compliance requirements there might be. But from a project control standpoint, actually one other thing too is making sure that the folks involved in the project, the contractors, the trade contractors, the second tier trades, the vendors, those that are eligible are taking advantage of the funding requirements or the funding that's being provided through the federal stimulus packages to keep the cash flow going, to keep these entities as viable concerns, just making sure that people are maximizing. We have seen some unintended consequences of the federal funding where folks are actually making more at some levels with the federal relief than they would be if they're working, and as a result, some trades not necessarily showing up. but that's been the exception, not the norm, but making sure that folks are taking advantage. But really what we're advising folks, set up mechanisms to track the cost of disruption. So whether these be dedicated accounting codes, project level tracking, you want to be able to cleanly capture the direct and indirect cost impacts at an adequate level of detail to allow you to, one, support potential recoveries and remedies, whatever they may be, and two, to arm you with data to inform future estimates. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But this tracking should be set up by all parties at all levels, owners, contractors, trades. To the extent possible, create a snapshot of where the project was at the time of disruption. Again, this will facilitate the ability of both the owners and the contractors to cleanly demonstrate the impact of disruption, supporting downstream remedies or reconciliations. They'll also draw a line in the sand, and prohibit either party to mask pre-existing conditions and try to shuffle them under the guise of COVID-related issues. You want to reforecast your project with new productivity assumptions to have a clear understanding of the new project trajectory. Leverage this reforecast to engage in a collaborative dialogue to explore opportunities to mitigate through acceleration. And also, we're encouraging folks to modify your field oversight protocol. So unfortunately, this situation does present opportunities for bad behavior. So material substitution due to supply chain disruption, quality issues given the use of non-standard crews or differing means and methods. So having folks out there monitoring the potential for those types of risks.
That's great.
Yeah, I'll chime in here as well. I think one of the most important things that the industry as a whole needs to think about is the status quo, and going above and beyond the status quo, particularly as it relates to what Rob was talking about, project tracking, schedule management. The status quo is not good enough. Monthly updates without digging into the details, talking about delays, in a broad perspective, coming up with reasons why that happened, and then making changes to the schedule that bring the end date in, and not studying compression, and then handing that off to the other side and saying, hey, look, things are going fine, is not the way it needs to go. I think right now everybody needs to go above and beyond. We all know what project controls are, what good project controls are. We've had a hard time as an industry incorporating them, and that's been due to budgetary constraints, experiential constraints, and it's time to go forward and step it up. And what do I mean by step it up? First of all, contractors need to invest in best practices. They need to, come hell or high water, invest in some of the best project controls they've ever done. Owners, on the other side, they need to understand this data. If they don't understand the data, they can't point the blame at the contractor. Contractors, if they're doing, their schedules, if they're providing good information and giving owners their opinion, contractors in general are optimistic, and that's a good thing, but it can sometimes be a bad thing when there's a little bit of over optimism and an owner plans around that and says, oh yeah, we're going to get done. So I would think about that. And the other thing about the industry is people need to be a little bit more forthright with the data. I've seen in my whole career a lot of guarded information, a lot of litigation. That's a big fear, and it's a real fear. Right now, we need to stop. We need to start showing information. We need to do as Josh suggested, is start being good business partners, start being more transparent and objective. On the scheduling side, we got a couple more comments here. Schedules need to be set up for success right now, and that means good quality, good logic. Discussions about how we're going to track delays need to have buy-in. We can't be running our projects forward with overly compressed schedules. The industry has a bad rap for making changes to keep end dates to an excessive place where everybody ends up being impacted in a negative way financially. So we need to think about that. Also, going forward, once we get these schedules set up for success and we know how we're going to track delays, there needs to be discussions before any changes are made. That's one big issue, is changes are made, they're not necessarily discussed, and then everybody moves forward, ready to rock. But some of these changes are unrealistic. All parties have risk, and they need to have a say. And I think that will be things that should happen more often. Scheduling meetings that require a lot of intense analytics and discussions and experience, and also trust. So those are my thoughts. If anybody needs additional information on that, we have written papers specifically for COVID that you can download from our site. You know, I took my consultative experience and wrote about 20 pages of information on schedule management subject matter. So feel free to download that.
That's great. So these are obviously unprecedented times, and with unprecedented times comes a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns. You know, looking forward, what are the biggest risks to future work? You know, future projects that you're seeing in your organization. So, Jim, from an insurance perspective.
Yeah, I'll touch real quickly on 3 topics that probably warrant their own webinar. So we'll be real quick. But, you know, what's interesting is we've been in unprecedented times of growth over the last number of years. And a little over a year ago, we started to talk actively with our partners around, you know, preparing for recession. And as recently as early March, right, you could go meet with a contractor, backlogs are strong, pipelines look strong, and aside from some potential unknowns, right, the prospect of recession was like, it was kind of hard to get your hands around. And yet, COVID has taken us so quickly down a steep ramp that nobody really foresaw coming. And there's so many unknowns. How might this recession be different than a, quote, normal recession? We don't know. We could spend time talking about macro economy, the global supply chain, how different sectors may get a bounce, while many, you know, private spending is going to be down, and many are going to probably be in for a prolonged slump. We could spend time talking about that, but I think ultimately the point is to be prepared. And no matter, despite the fact that there's unknowns, no matter where you sit, every business can be taking steps right now to look at where they stand and what they need to do in the next term to be best prepared for success. So really, you know, I'll talk a little bit about reassessing and focusing a business plan and learning from the past. What are those things that you vowed you would not repeat? As a business, make sure you have a process to make sure you don't do that. And same thing for the practices that really set you up for success. Make sure you're going to repeat those. And probably the key practice we see around that is kind of a project selection, project go, no go type of process. And really what that builds around is the idea that you build a framework of what makes your project successful, and you commit to those things in an objective way that allows senior leaders a basis for assessing a project's likelihood of success and minimizing exceptions and only going down those paths when there's a real strategy that negates the negative impact and that can be managed. So really revisiting kind of those processes and assuring that they're going to set a business up for success is the second item. And really the third, you know, the industry is so reliant on specialty trade contractors to perform the bulk of work on projects that they need to be considered partners. And it's very short-sighted to think that you can go down the path of pushing risk and pushing low price down to that level, yet expect optimal performance. So it's really critical that you choose wisely and choose smartly and play the long game. That's really what a lot of this discussion is about, is not being short-sighted, but play the long game. The industry's made a lot of strides in the last 10 years or so when I've been really focusing this around subcontractor pre-qualification, procurement practices, and how do you effectively analyze entirety of risk and make well-informed partners. And now's the time to kind of take a look at those and refine them, and where do we need to engage a little bit differently. Maybe it's refining financial ratios, focusing a little bit differently on liquidity. Maybe it's what is the real financial data that we need that gives us the right, current, and accurate information on which to base decisions. Maybe it's how do we talk to and communicate with our contractors and our subcontractors to understand how they're managing their business. Why eyes wide open are they with the risks, and how are they managing it? Not just on your job, but on other jobs. Those are all things that really impact their ability to be here for the future. And also, don't forget about the operations folks, right? The folks on the front line that are de-scoping and ultimately managing these subcontractors. They have a different level of engagement with the subs that can glean tremendous information for your company around who is the right subcontractor or trade partner to engage with. And I think of it as a check and balance, right? You need the check of the financial side to make sure that the subcontractor has a foundation to perform. And you also need the foundation of that operational side. And they can't be done in a silo. They have to be married together to help set you up for success.
No, that's great. And Josh, I know you're on both sides of the equation, right? So signing contracts with owners and then issuing contract to subcontractors. So what do you see going forward as some of the biggest risks and how to?
Yeah, so I've got a thought specific to this pandemic, and then maybe some based on just historical data, which I think is the best way that we can, best data to manage from. So, the basics of how construction contracts have come into place as they are constituted today is that they're just built on the lessons learned, right? I'm sure everybody listening to this project or to this webinar has some hot button issue that has come up on a project or a claim or something in the past, and they go and embed that in every deal that they do moving forward. So I think the really low hanging fruit is, let's make sure that we properly account for COVID in our contracts moving forward, right? Especially as we're hearing now that the impacts or maybe the life cycle of this pandemic may linger for longer than we initially thought. Even if things start normalizing again in the industry, it's going to change the way we operate. So making sure the low hanging fruit is, let's make sure that our contract terms are clear and there's provisions, that weren't really heavily negotiated before in the past, at least in my career, like what the contractor's rights are to protect life and safety on the project and how they may be entitled to change orders, right? That starts to become a lot more relevant of a provision when somebody gets diagnosed with COVID, and now the contractor may be invoking the right to say, owner, I don't care what you're saying, I'm issuing a stand down. Or the owner may want to say that because it's the right thing to do or whatnot. So making sure, the low hanging fruit is, let's clean up our contracts. A lot of what's going on right now is slipping through the boilerplate cracks of the contracts that the industry is using. And I'm sure that none of us want to relive these lessons again. Another one to think about is, generally speaking, force majeure is based on an event being unforeseeable, right? Well, this is foreseeable now. So on a moving forward basis, even the force majeure framework would need to be modified to account for, okay, yes, it's foreseeable, but we still may not know the impacts at the time that we're coming to contract. So let's account for that risk in the contract. So anything related to COVID certainly needs to find its way into the contract so that the risk is equitably balanced among the parties and doesn't create a situation where, unfortunately, Jim has to get involved and you're dealing with some sort of a catastrophic, failure because somebody has accepted a term that's just too onerous and potentially could torpedo their business. And that kind of goes to the second point, which I think, luckily, I guess the good news for everybody, most of the people I'm sure on this phone call, is that we've actually all been here before, right? We've all had to come out of a recession as an industry, and a lot of lessons learned can be applied here. So coming out of recessions, what happens? Well, companies are desperate for deals, right? They want to start backfilling their work. They may have become slightly under-resourced as they're now bouncing back, and potentially people are setting themselves up. There's the potential that folks that aren't disciplined are going to take bad terms just because they're desperate for a deal or they feel the pressure that they've got to get work started or whatnot. Those are the types of terms which can sink companies. So I would urge that companies play the long game and exercise caution and not succumb to just the desperation, which is pretty easy for me to say sitting here. But the reality is, if you want to be in business for a long time, I think history tells us that that's a best practice. And to that end, also coming out of these recessions, take advantage of the efficiencies that you have the opportunity to gain today, so that you come out of this recession leaner, with a better grasp of technology. Going back to this just macro trend in this industry, we are one of the worst major industries to adopt technology, but there is certainly technology. Frankly, right on this phone call, there's representatives that can deploy technology that allow you to do more with less. So utilize that technology to make data-driven decisions, to make sure that you're de-risking your projects, or at least balancing the risk in your projects in a way that you're not accepting bad schedules, bad contract terms, or frankly, just bad deals. And if you do those things, whether COVID or the crash, a decade ago, whatever it may be, if you do those things, you have the best chances for long-term success. And so there are ways to do that, and I think that's some of the thing to be optimistic about is we've kind of all been here before. We know what it takes. We have a blueprint for how you build a successful operation coming out of a downturn like this. And it does start with appropriate risk management and making sure that you're accepting deals that are equitable. And that all, a lot of that lays in the contract. So knowing what's in your contract and making sure your contract is adequately drafted is critical for your ability to manage your enterprise on a moving forward basis.
That's great. So Rob, looking forward, how do you see the impacts of COVID changing the way project participants incorporate risk into their project assumptions?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question, right? How do you account for this risk going forward in your pricing assumptions and your scheduling forecast? Is COVID-19, is it a black swan event, or should the industry be working pandemic risk into their baseline assumptions going forward? Are these social distancing protocols temporary? Will these become permanent measures? We've all heard of the potential for a second wave in the fall or winter of 2020. So, when does today end? And, when does tomorrow begin? From a practical standpoint, will we see an increased appetite for new means and methods, modular prefabrication to mitigate the number of resources on site? Will we see increased use of technology to replace the project trailer? So virtual project trailers. So how do you really price risk? How do you price change and remain competitive? In the near term, the market will take some time to truly reveal the impact. We don't have the benefit of having this body of empirical project data that can be leveraged as an input to future estimates. Hence, one of the reasons why we're recommending that people now start collecting this data so that they can measure their impact to begin to build that body of historical project data. That data will be somewhat muted because people are able to offset in some respects by taking advantage of acceleration opportunities, increased labor access. Those opportunities we can expect will dissipate as more projects come back online. But really what you can expect in the near term is large bid spreads on projects as contractors react differently to this exposure. And this potentially compromises the effectiveness of the bidding process. So it will be important to have visibility and transparency into the assumptions that the contractors are incorporating into their bids. And for those owners who operate in a low bid environment, are you comfortable that the low bidder has adequately considered risk? Or will downstream issues manifest that may end up in default or dispute? So perhaps what we'll see is the change in behaviors from traditional design bid build to really a more collaborative approach as owners, designers, contractors become partners in the development of project budgets and schedules. Collaborative evaluation of risks, sort of in line with the integrated project delivery model. We may see phase bidding on projects to ring fence risks, and advance through the life cycle in a more measured way aligned with better information and proper risk allocation. But while some may view this as an opportunity to flex their contractual leverage, take advantage of market opportunities, shift risks in an imbalanced way, possibly, the bottom line is that it really doesn't benefit anybody to have a large imbalance in risk.
Yeah, right, I think that ties in. Sorry, Mike. I think that ties in directly to you. I know you mentioned before about some increased rigor to reduce those things from happening.
Yeah. I'll chime in here. One thing that I think that the industry needs to start thinking about and change is its over-optimistic and reactive nature. Generally speaking, everybody hopes for the best, and when things happen, they react. The whole risk management process is not that. It's about predicting problems and understanding that they're there. I think if anybody's, most of the people on this call have been involved in quite a few construction projects, and I think we all know nothing ever goes as planned. End dates are rarely met, budgets are rarely met, and it's all because the risks aren't necessarily being thought through even at the beginning of the contract. I think the more risk-based, realistic approach to management is definitely an important thing. And I also think that that needs to be driven from the top down. You know, if you think about the guys on the project site, you know, they're handed a project with, you know, a timeline that's difficult and a budget that's difficult, and feeling as if they're a failure for not reaching these things. I think that risk needs to be discussed at the contract level, at the agreement level. Simultaneously, I think a thing that the industry really needs to start improving on is resource tracking and analytics. You know, resources are the lifeblood of construction. Productivity is the lifeblood of construction. Everything about direct manpower is what drives schedule, yet nobody ever resource loads a schedule, or not nobody, but rarely ever resource loads a schedule. Subcontractors don't share that information. GCs don't want to take the time to estimate it, and owners are sitting there scratching their heads. I think, you know, for this industry to manage through what could be the worst set of claims that's ever happened in construction, to avoid that, is to start being very, very transparent with resource requirements, and then actuals against that, and then understanding why those impacts are happening, discussing it frequently. And again, I can't reiterate this more. This cannot be the tail that wags the dog. Site teams can't be making these decisions. It needs to come from the top. Those are my thoughts there.
No, that's great. And speaking with a lot of clients that I have out there, you know, it seems to be sometimes a little bit of a two-sided story here. You know, a lot of owners think costs are going to go down. A lot of contractors think costs are going to go up. So question is there a COVID premium related to this? Josh, I'll start with you. How do you balance staying competitive with protecting your organization's interests with so many unknowns?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to your question is we've got a situation in front of us which is tangible, it's real. The true long-term impacts have yet to been realized. Even at this point, you know, even though it feels like this has been going on forever, we know we still have a long road ahead of us. So I think the short answer to your question is there's certainly a COVID premium. The question is, who bears that premium, right? There is risk associated with project delivery that is directly correlated to this pandemic that we find ourselves in. And this kind of now goes back to that concept of being able to make, I guess, rational decisions based upon data. So what do you do with that premium? Do you say that premium is best shared? Kind of, you know, you think about this is kind of analogous to like a weather day framework, right? We know that weather is something we can forecast, but nobody can assure. And so on construction projects, who bears that risk of weather? Well, there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. Sometimes owners say, contractor, you bear that risk. You base your schedule on assumed weather days based on, you know, historical averages, and anything over that is on you. Sometimes contractors say, well, I'm not willing to bear that risk, or I haven't priced that risk, and if you want the known, you know, price that I'm willing to commit to today, we're going to have to figure out how you may bear some of that risk. So the same kind of logic applies here with this pandemic. Yes, there is a premium. You know, personally, I don't believe that premium should be borne by any one party. And perhaps if we're looking long-term and knowing this is a relationship-based business, I would urge that folks get creative and think through, you know, who is best suited to bear that risk, as there's a lot of facets of that risk. But yes, there is a premium. No, I do not think the premium should be borne by one person. But that all just depends on what your appetite for risk is, what your relationships with the trade partners that you work with are, what your relationship is with the owner that you work with is, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly there is a premium to pretend that there's not the companies that pretend that there's not a premium associated with COVID will likely be burned by COVID, because there's just too much unknown risk that still lays out there. And I'm not sure that anybody is the best suited to manage the risk, but maybe that premium could be spread out and minimized across numerous parties, as opposed to pushing that entire premium down to one party in the form of higher cost of construction, or, you know, fatter schedules, or, just screw you, subcontractor, you need to eat this and I'll put you out of business if things go wrong. So, that I think is the answer. Yes, there's certainly a premium associated with COVID.
And Jim, I'll pass it to you. It sounds great to be able to share that premium across all the parties. But what are your thoughts on the COVID premium and how to advise clients on staying competitive going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the concepts Josh laid out, right? And frankly, the things we're talking about on this call don't come for free, right? The industry can innovate, we can get better at things, but there's been enough things discussed on this call that do come with a real cost, and I think that's real. I think one of the things that Josh touched on that I would emphasize is, the fair allocation of risk to those who can best manage it. And, looking at it through the lens of sub-default insurance, right, we get to look at a lot of subcontracts, and many of those terms get pretty onerous. And in many ways, the subcontractor doesn't necessarily have the same rights that the general contractor negotiated for themselves, yet it can be argued that they are more at risk for some of those elements. So I would certainly advocate for a fair allocation of risk, and that has to be part of the equation that comes to light here. And my other concern is just how the industry long-term historically typically forgets what we're feeling right now, right? Josh mentioned it earlier. Once contractors start to become hungry or desperate, or an owner sees the opportunity to get the big discount, there are going to be companies that agree to do that. And that's not a long plan. That's going to be a short-term gain for a long-term, maybe probably not in business. And that's probably my concern, is how quickly do we forget, or how quickly do we get into that competitive landscape that puts us back in that situation that puts the lowest tiers at risk.
No, that's great. With all the pressures impacting projects, it definitely creates uncertainty around how future projects will be developed, procured, and built. What actions are you recommending organizations take for future projects, Mike?
Well, I'll start with some commentary. I think that contractors are understanding that this is more uncertainty than they're comfortable with. As a matter of fact, once we started advertising that we were doing this call, some contractors even started providing their contractual language that they're putting into the contract, stating that COVID exists. We know it'll impact the job. This bid that we're putting together has nothing to do with the project being impacted by COVID, and we need to understand those costs as we go. I think that's a great first step, as long as everybody remains on the same page. And I think that if we were to think about but the best way that this could be managed going forward is to know that budgets are difficult right now. There is going to be additional cost potentially, more so than we're used to. The industry, the unknowns currently with weather and changes and, differing, conditions economically will spike the contract cost. But COVID's a whole new animal here. I think if I were to think what would work best to optimize the process, well, teams need to know that going in, and they need to not just sign a contract at the beginning and say, that's it, and anything above and beyond we're not paying for unless you can prove to me. I do think that needs to be the case, but I think that there needs to be more frequent, discussions of, okay, how did the last quarter go? How did the schedule go? What sort of impacts were there? Who had productivity issues? Why? What delays occurred? What does that mean for the project? How are we all going to effectively agree on how to manage going forward with data as the backbone to our decision making? And that brings me to another point. I think we will notice, it's already started about a year or two ago, that we start seeing people's titles in construction as the data analyst. I think that's going to be more frequent. I think data analysts are going to be almost as common as schedulers. I think there's going to be more schedulers out there. I think PMs are going to get better at it. So, at the end of the day, as an advisor, as an analyst, as a project controls guy, I think that the industry is moving in that direction. This has been a catalyst for those things, which is much needed change, and it's going to reduce the disputes in the long term. Short term, we've got a lot of change management issues to deal with, but I think, from what I'm seeing and hearing, most people are ready to roll, and the technology's there, the experience is there. The last 20 years, the industry advanced leaps and bounds in understanding construction data. So that's the way I look at it.
That's great. I know that we're coming close to time, but we have some questions. I tried to weave those in on some that we asked before, but a couple that jumped out here. Jim, this one would be for you. What changes are likely to happen, if any, in the SDI industry to mitigate the inevitable increase in subcontractor failure rates?
Yeah, subcontractor performance protection is needed, right? I mean, there are still in this country a lot of places where that's seen as not necessary, and I think the movement is natural that there needs to be protection. And the two basic things, surety and SDI, both have their space, right? When I think of SDI, though, the product is really built around relationship and partnership. As a carrier, we spend a lot of time working with our partners to understand everything from their business plan to how they procure projects to how they procure subcontracts, scheduling, etc., and the way they manage that risk. And that approach is not going to change. I think we're going to have some new areas to focus. And what's really important to us is some of the things we've talked about on this call is how is the business evolving to address this risk? What steps are you taking to be better at this? And there are going to be elements, right, where pricing may be impacted, where terms may be impacted, but there are a lot of unknowns, and we're trying to figure that out. But a big piece of that over time is what steps are being taken to better manage this risk. SDI specifically, right, I mentioned a partnership. Contractors take on large retentions to have that product. There is real skin in the game, and that's part of the equation, and it's frankly part of what makes the product work. We're in it together, and demonstrated success in managing that product does not mean you don't have some loss, but there are real things to be evaluated, considered in the level of that risk.
That's great. And I know that we're getting very close to the time here, so just to wrap things up, there have been a lot of great insights shared by our panelists. In summary, it goes without saying that the COVID impacts are a legitimate enterprise risk to each stakeholder. The first steps in managing through this is to develop an accurate snapshot of the current landscape, which includes knowing what your contract says, reviewing your contracts to understand those requirements and assess the associated risks and impacts that are happening or may occur. And also to understand what your schedule is reporting. It is a key piece of documentation needed to substantiate any impacts and support any cost or schedule adjustments that you're requesting. Going forward, there are new factors are coming into play, and you'll need to plan now how to prepare for the long term, to set up mitigation strategies that allow you to be proactive instead of reactive. With all the different safety regulations that are out there and will continue to come on job sites and through the equipment and material supply chain, jobs are going to take a bit longer. The types of projects available to bid could change, which would result in tighter bidding. Costs are definitely going to be impacted. So go forward, the focus should be on contractual terms that allow each partner to understand and price the risk appropriately, focusing on what you do best, and bring a much more analytical approach to both schedule management and project controls. It'll allow everyone to understand the current state of projects and the true impacts that occur now and in the future. With that, I thank everyone for joining the webinar today. Thank the panelists for providing their insights. There will be some, John, if you want to talk about what comes next from a delivery standpoint.
Yeah, this video was recorded, so it will be distributed after completion here today. I know we do have a number of other questions that we just haven't had time to get to as we're going over our hour here. But we will try to answer those questions along with sharing the video. So be assured that we will get to those questions, and we will distribute those out to everyone who attended today. I think that's all. I want to thank everyone again for joining, and especially our panelists for providing their insight and great information on how to proceed going forward.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Paul.
Have a good one,
Take care
guys.
and take care of yourselves.
Thank you.